Before we get into the mail out, we're following up as we always do, continuing these thoughts that establish that God is at the center of everything. And in our mail outs, establishing the evidence for God, the evidence for His Word. There's something that I noticed about Mark 9 that I'm not sure had really dawned on me like it should have. Now I want you to think, how did the reading start when Derek was reading? Jesus came down off the mountain. So it's right after the transfiguration. It's something that nobody in this crowd witnessed. It was for those select three. And yet it says when they saw Jesus, they were amazed. Now you think about that. He simply walks into their presence and it blows them away. Oh, to have that reaction. Oh, to have that reaction when we walk into worship where He makes Himself present with us. Oh, to have that reaction when I bow before the throne in prayer and realize that I'm in the presence of the Son of God. Just to be amazed, to be graced that way. All right, so we're going to pretend this morning, getting on schedule with our thoughts, we're going to pretend for a minute that I decide I want to change faith systems. Pretend that I begin to evaluate and begin to investigate faith systems that are available to us in this world. And you have so many. You have those that are outside of Christianity. Islam, Buddhism. You have those that fall under a very large umbrella of misnomer of Christianity. And then you have the one that denies the existence of a supreme being, atheism. And I'm going to consider it as a faith system if I'm going to be honest and I'm going to find the faith system that is real and has the right evidence to lead to that step of belief. I have to examine atheism as well. Now I need you to remember back now, we've established that both Christianity as well as the other world religions and atheism are faith systems. The evidence goes as far as it goes. Depending on which one you choose, more evidence for some. And then when the evidence comes to a stop, there has to be a step of faith that says, this is where the evidence led me. I cannot see the rest of it. Science can only go so far. Visual understanding can only go so far. And so I take a step of faith. That's what Hebrews 11 is about. That is that explanation in Hebrews 11. Evidence and substance for things that we cannot see or touch, but the things that we can see or touch lead us to the point where we accept God exists or we deny God's existence. So, as I'm taking this journey and I am going to honestly evaluate these systems, specifically atheism, is there enough evidence for me to take that step of faith that is required to be an atheist? Can I take the evidence that's available, go where it leads, and then take that last step? Does it make sense? Well, we've discussed the buying. So, having looked at that evidence, if I'm going to be an atheist, I'm going to have to ignore the fact that it defies the scientific rule that nothing produces nothing. So I'm going to do that this morning. I'm going to ignore the initial evidence. Matter either is created or it is eternal. It doesn't pop out of nothing. But I'm going to say it does for the sake of this experiment. You're going to have to let me have the bang. Let me have a starting point where nothing exploded and it created. And then once it exploded, once it created, the non-biologicals in that system began to bump into each other. And they created life. Is there enough evidence for me to take that step of faith? Is there enough evidence of life coming from non-life to say, yep, that is how it happened? That's what has to happen as an atheist. I have to get back past the fact that the bang defies the laws of science. And I have to say it happened anyway. That nothing banged, things came into existence, and then they began to bump into each other, even though they were not alive. And one day, life came about. So the text that we read, the title, the connection. This man is there with Jesus and the disciples, and he needs his son to be healed. And he has believed enough that he has come to Jesus as the source of that healing. But he's not completely convinced. If it's possible, Jesus, I need you to heal him. And Jesus' reaction, if, oh, how long am I going to have to put up with you guys? Bring him to me. But the Father says, look, I believe as far as I can. Help my unbelief. I believe life exists. I can kind of see it. I can kind of see it as you move around me. As you blink, as you nod off into sleep as I talk, as you wake back up. I can see it as we interact and as you learn and His intelligence is there. So I need help with my unbelief. I need help if I'm going to make this transition to atheism to help my unbelief that it exists by chance, that it exists by accident, that it exists by this combination of random events. So is it possible? Is there evidence that is even the slightest possibility that life can come from non-life? A lot of this information I'm about to give you comes from the website Biology Online. Some of the definitions. One of the definitions you will find there is the law of biogenesis. Notice the word law. This is a scientific law, which means it's been proven over and over and over. And it says life comes from life. The word bio means life. The word genesis means beginnings or origins. And so science has put into place a law that says life has beginnings. And it states that life arises from pre-existing life, not from non-living matter. It means that a non-living thing would not have the capacity to engender a living thing. Only life can do that. The complex, organized structures and processes in living organisms cannot spontaneously arise or develop through chemical reactions or physical means alone. Something has to act on them. They require a pre-existing living system as the source of new life. Make that very simple. The law of biogenesis, the scientific law that a biologist takes with him at the beginning of his trek to understand our world, states unequivocally, that word means in a way that leaves no doubt. The law states in a way that leaves no doubt that life creates life. And life can only come from a pre-existing life or other living things and not from non-life. So, their law says that unless something outside of that closed system acts on that system, that non-life can bump into itself forever. And it defies science that something will come to life. Connected to that is what's called the cell theory. And it's the fact that every living thing is made up of cells. And that cells can only come from pre-existing cells. So they line up side by side. Look about the middle. Underscores the necessity of pre-existing life for the generation of new life forms, reproduction. So the law of biogenesis and the cell theory refute life from non-life. So if I'm going to convert to atheism and I have to account for life because we're here, but it couldn't come from non-life, what's my solution? Well, what they've decided to do is suspend that law. It doesn't count in the beginning. It only comes into existence later on because it does not fit their belief system. So they add a prefix to it. They add the letter A to the word biogenesis. And they come up with the word abiogenesis, and it means life from non-life. A is a negative as a prefix. So, not life from the beginning. So what? They've taken an irrefutable, immutable, unequivocal law and said it is only a law until it's inconvenient. And then we set it aside and we make up a new one so that it fits our system. Now you get this, right? What they've had to do is say, we have a system in place that this is how we believe it happened. And since the laws don't work, we will suspend them until we're happy with them. And we'll put another one in place for the beginning. They also claim that this law of abiogenesis takes into account the condition of the earth 3.5 billion years ago. The very primitive life on earth, not as structurally complex as modern life. So the context of abiogenesis, when you dumb the world down, could explain that transition. Could explain that transition from prebiotic world, characterized by non-living molecules and chemical reactions, to a biotic world where living organisms of increasingly complex molecules abound, could have occurred billion years ago. Beyond the grammatical mistakes, I typed that exactly like it was, on purpose. I want you to think about the repetitive, confusing verbiage designed to confuse us. Prebiotic, self-explanatory, but they've got to go on and say characterized by non-living. Let's just add some extra words in here so that the longer you read, the more you forget what you've read before. Then they go to biotic. Explains itself, but then they have to say where living organisms exist. So give me enough words when I change the laws to fit my belief system that I can confuse you. And when I get through writing, I'll come back and say life came from non-life. And you're going to be so confused by everything I said, that's all you're going to pick up. I'm going to make it make sense to you. So we have to change the laws, and we have to word them in such a way that nobody understands them. Then we can make our point. So atheists want me to believe, this is the faith step I'm being asked to take as I evaluate the system, that life came into existence from non-life. Hear me. A belief they cannot even propose without suspending their own law and replacing it with a new one. And you want to sell me that. You want me to buy that. There are three keys to their belief to prop up this system. Number one, give me enough time and I can make it work out. Number two, give me enough random bumps in the night, enough chances at this, and it'll work out. And number three, we have to start with the simplest thing possible. We're going to deal with number one tonight, the idea of time. Now, I'm going to actually help you understand that time is an evolutionist's worst nightmare. They promise you they do not want 3.5 billion years. So let's deal with the other two. Give me enough random bumps in the night and non-life will produce life. If I ignore the explosion and I ignore the flying apart of things, the bang that explodes and sends things moving away from each other, ignore the second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy that says things do not come back together. When they explode and begin moving apart, they go farther and farther apart. And the system continues to grow more and more random. It breaks down. They don't come back together and bump into each other. We'll deal with that a little bit tonight. But for now, what we're going to do is ignore that. And we're going to pretend that when things explode, they stay close enough together that they keep bumping into each other repeatedly. How many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop? There's actually been experiments on that as if we didn't have anything else to do. How many bumps in the night does it take to produce life? How long do I have to give you to let these random, non-living things bump into each other and produce life? The answer? How many times do you have to blow up the same printing house to produce War and Peace? I'll give you as long as you want. Those things can bump together forever. And the law that you want to suspend says that they cannot produce life. It's an absurd question. Both of those questions are absurd. How many times do things have to bump in together to produce life? How many times do you have to blow up a printing house, produce war and peace? When you start with an absurd proposal, you build an absurd argument. Atheists ridiculously start with an impossible task. Life from non-life. It defies the law of biogenesis. This is a basketball goal. All right? It's not the same size as the one you see when you go in the gym, but it has a rim, it has a net, it has a backboard. It is a basketball goal. This is a regulation size men's basketball. On a real basketball court, if you walk into the gym at Clements High School, I show this to every team I coach from day one when they're 5 years old. You can actually take two of these side by side and they will go through the rim of a basketball goal. But we're looking at absurd things that are impossible. How many times am I going to have to shoot this basketball to make it go through this net? My basketball goal fell apart. Why? Because my law fell apart. I can't do what is impossible. I can shoot this ball for eternity, and it'll never go through that net. So, I get a bigger one. It's not going to go. Shoot it all day long. So what do I have to do? I have to change the rules. I've either got to let the air out of my ball, or I got to stretch the rim. It's an absurd question. How many times has something got to bump into something else to create life? Well, the law says it can never do it. The law says that's never going through that rim. Why start with an absurdity that cannot be done and then ask me to believe it just because you're going to repeat it over and over and over? Scientists have been trying to prove since the 1600s that life can pop out of non-life. Francesco Redi, 1626, 1697. The prevailing theory in his world was that if you take a pile of dirty rags and you put them in the corner of your room and leave them there long enough, they will spontaneously generate a rat. That one day you're going to come in and a rat's just going to crawl out of there. So what he did, and I'm sorry about this, he did it with maggots. What he did was he took a jar and sealed it with rotten meat in it and left it there. And maggots never popped out of it. And he figured out that if you don't have the fly to lay the egg, the life to put down the life, to bring forth the life, that it would sit there forever and no maggot would pop out of the meat. Well, somebody claimed, well, it's the air's fault. All right, the spontaneous life is going to pop out of the air. So because he put it in a sealed container, they wanted to invalidate his conclusions. So, 200 years later, Louis Pasteur one-upped those people. And he sterilized the curved neck of a flask filled with broth. So the broth is in the bottom, the flask is curved, but it's open. Air can go in and out. But because it's curved, microorganisms cannot go in. So life's not getting in. Guess what? Nothing popped up in the broth. There was no life to put life into the broth stayed dead. No life. How many chances do you want? You've been trying since the 1600s to suspend the law that you know to be law, and yet you want me to believe it? You want me to take that step of faith and say, oh, it happened that way. You can't prove it. What is the definition of insanity? What is it we say? Doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. It is insane after all of these years to keep doing the same thing over and over, expecting life to pop out of the rotten meat or the sterile flask. Well, atheist arguing here. It's only been 400 years since the first picture. It's only been 130 years since Pasteur. I need more time. Chance and evolution had 3.5 billion, and so that's how it finally worked out. I told you I'm going to cover that tonight. Time is not their friend. They don't want 3.5 billion years. It's the worst thing that they could have. But at this point, and I'm sorry to be so snarky and smart-aleck about it, but I really have an issue with ignorance and stupidity. It cracks me up that I am being asked to believe that randomness, that accident, supposedly did what the most intelligent men and women in scientific history cannot do, even though they produce or reproduce the experiments every day trying to get life out of non-life. Please, world, do not insult my intelligence. The very fact that the brightest minds in our world cannot do it means what? It means randomness certainly could not do it. Therefore, there has to be a power more intelligent than humanity's brightest. By the way, back to what we read earlier, the cell theory says the same thing. All living things composed of cells, they can only come from cells. What does that sound like? Sounds like the book of Genesis, doesn't it? Kind after its kind. God said, I'll put the first one in place, and then from then on it's going to work. If you cannot get the first one in place by randomness, and you cannot get the first one in place by human intelligence, God had to do it. Very quickly, we'll close in a minute. Simple to the complex. They argue that, well, we've got to go back to this law of biogenesis. And we've got to make sure that we understand that primitive life on earth was not as complex as modern life. So they're saying, we're not asking you to believe that randomness brought about humanity. We want you to believe that randomness brought about an amoeba. So we start with something very simple. If we start with something simple enough, life can come from non-life. Okay. All right, I'm going to investigate. I want to be an atheist. I want to believe this. Let's go with a one-celled amoeba. Made up of DNA just like everything else. Those 4 nitrogen-based proteins that create a unique code for every living thing. We all have them. A simple amoeba's DNA code with the 4 letters lined up in a specific order to make that amoeba. The code itself for a one-celled organism would fill 1,000 sets of the Encyclopedia Britannica. 2010 version of the Encyclopedia Britannica, 15th and final printed edition, is 32 volumes. 32,640 pages per set. And the DNA of amoeba will fill up 1,000 of those. So the simplest thing that we can come up with to study its DNA would take 32,640,000 pages just to write out the code of its DNA. And that's the simple one. Seriously, people, please. You want me to believe that if those things keep bumping into each other randomly long enough, they better get to work, because they got a long way to go. We'll get to number 3 tonight, but listen for this right now, and before I trip over this. I do not have enough faith to be an atheist. And there's actually a book out there by that title that will blow you away. It is unbelievable, the ridiculous claims that we have to believe to take the step of faith. And here's the ending. I'm not the only one. The last quote in the mail out, and in case you didn't read the mail out, Michael Denton. Michael Denton is an atheist. The complexity of the simplest known type of cell is so great that it is impossible to accept that such an object could have been thrown together suddenly by some kind of freakish, vastly improbable event. Such an occurrence would be indistinguishable from a miracle. The atheists do not even believe their own garbage because it defies the laws in place. And they want me to take that step of faith. Don't be ridiculous. Young people, learn this information. It will change the way you go through school, because you will learn to make sense of the nonsensical. And it will strengthen your faith in God as we stand and sing.